It all started with a very simple idea. Tell the stories of how successful middle market CEOs made it to the corner office. I'm Brant Handley, founder and managing director of Resource Options International, or ROI. We're the USA's premier executive search firm focused exclusively on empowering middle market companies to attract, hire, and retain A players while transforming top executives' careers and lives. ROI's Into the Corner office is dedicated to discovering how middle market CEOs advance their career, and we're making these remarkable and sometimes quite unbelievable stories available to you for the very first time. Listen and learn about the challenges they've overcome, the interesting people they've met along the way, and the lessons learned that steered these executives' unique journey into a middle market corner office of their own. I know you enjoy these CEO stories as much as I've enjoyed recording them. So thank you for listening today. And if you like what you've heard, rate us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm looking forward to you joining me on the next great middle market CEO adventure into the corner office. Today, my guest is Chuck Proudfit, president of SKILLSOURCE and founder of At Work on Purpose. SKILLSOURCE delivers sustainable growth in sales, profits, and people to client companies through a focus on winning strategies, strong leadership, and healthy cultures. Chuck developed his general management expertise at 3 industry-leading firms, the Procter Gamble Company, Ernest Julio Gallo, and LensCrafters. Chuck earned his academic degree from Harvard University, where he pioneered the school's organizational development curriculum. Chuck is also the founder of At Work on Purpose, a ministry guiding Christians to integrate faith and work. He also serves on the faculty for Transform Our World, an alliance of marketplace and ministry leaders working together to make the world a better place. Chuck holds a black belt in Taekwondo, serves as an elder at Grace Chapel near his home in Mason, Ohio, and periodically leads business people on mission trips to under-resourced countries. Chuck and his wife Gerald are the proud parents of Aiden and Maya, both adopted as infants from South Korea. Chuck Proudfit, welcome into the corner office.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Great to have you here today. And I know when I was plugging in the phone and saw the 513 area code, it reminded me of my happy days in Cincinnati. And you and I actually were at Procter Gamble together. We found out, didn't know each other at the time.
Yes, we were.
Walked those hallowed halls around the same time. And it's so funny how people keep their area codes in their cell phones, right? And, you know, it kind of keeps us into that port of call for many, many years. But you still live in Cincinnati, is that right?
I do.
Yeah. Well, we want to hear more about that in some of those early years, but we like to kind of start with, what happened, as you were growing up. Tell me a little bit about what your early family life was like, where you grew up and, your parents and what they did.
Sure. I was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan. My parents were in graduate school at the university there studying English. They became English professors. And when I was a year old, we moved to Boulder, Colorado, which is where I grew up. I was what some call a college brat, which basically means that I was surrounded by academics, professors and their kids, and also by Boulder, which is a very scenic outdoors kind of community right at the foot of the Rocky Mountains.
Beautiful there. Yeah, absolutely. Brothers and sisters?
Yes, one sister, 3 years younger than I am.
Yeah, cool. And parents were professors pretty much your whole youth growing up, and you kind of lived in that environment. Did they move around a lot, or were you in Colorado for most of those early years?
No, we stayed in Colorado most of the time. My parents both taught at the university with a different area of specialty. In my dad's case, romantic English poets, and in my mother's case, women in literature like Virginia Woolf. So they both had niches in their field. But I did spend a year in London in 1973-74. Dad was researching a guy named Walter Savage Landor, who's an esoteric romantic poet. Most of your listeners will definitely never have heard of. And my mother, since we were out there anyway, she decided to get a graduate degree in art history as a complement to the studies she'd already had. So both of my parents were involved academically, and my sister and I were just school age, and we were attending school.
Yeah, that's awesome. And did you grow up in a Christian household? Were your parents fairly spiritual in that sense, or did that come later in life?
That came later in life for me. My parents had grown up in the Christian church, but they, for different reasons, had walked away from it. So it wasn't part of my childhood, although I kind of knew it was out there.
Right, right. Well, what were the kinds of things that inspired you growing up? Were there, specific people, coaches, perhaps teachers that, had an impact on you and during those early days that, kind of made a formative path for you to follow?
Looking back at it, I think there were a couple things. One of them was just because of the educational environment in which I grew up, learning was prized.
Yeah.
And so when I would have an exceptional teacher or learning experience, that was something very significant for me. It was something that would catch my attention because in my family, we were always calling that out.
Right.
I remember music was something I did quite a bit with growing up. I was in the orchestra, the band, the jazz band, and I spent a couple summers at Interlochen Music Camp, which is a really prestigious place to do some early life music work with musicians that came from different parts of the world. So that also was part of my upbringing. And the one other thing that comes to mind since you asked was an annual conference in Boulder called the World Affairs Conference. And what would happen is that people like my parents would host a guest, and there were hundreds that would come into the city, and then they would gather together for symposiums on different kinds of world events. But because these people stayed in our homes, we got a chance to get to know them. And these were really remarkable, accomplished figures from all kinds of professional life. So that was a
all
third
over the world,
touch point
or
for me.
were they
All over the
domestic?
world. Yeah.
Wow. Fabulous. Fabulous. Really broadened your horizon, I'm sure, as a younger child. Yeah. And it goes without saying, I'm sure you were a pretty good student in school. I can't imagine coming home with, D's and F's with your parents being professors. That never happened, right, Chuck?
It's funny you should mention that. My father was very understanding, whatever my grades were, I think because his grades probably weren't always the best. My mother, on the other hand, was like a hawk. So anytime there was a grade that wasn't quite where it should be, she would definitely call that out. So there was a certain rigor and expectation that was part of my childhood, no question.
It sounded like some drilling down going on to some of those late evenings and homework, I imagine.
Yes.
And what about outside the class? Were you involved in sports, music, debate, theater? What other kinds of things did you get involved with as a kid?
The big hobby that I had was music. I did a lot with that. I took lessons on the clarinet, saxophone, piano.
Wow.
And I also loved the outdoors. So I'd spend a lot of time hiking in the mountains, camping, and in the wintertime skiing.
Oh, yeah. Love it. Love it. And what about entrepreneurial things? Were there things that you did as a kid, the ubiquitous paper route or selling Christmas cards at Christmas time, this kind of stuff?
Yes. And eventually it took me to a place where my parents didn't quite know what to do with me.
Wow, this is an interesting story. All right, I want to hear it.
When you have two very intellectual academic parents and you have a son who's very entrepreneurially minded, after a while, as you are a kid growing up, you get to a point in your development where your parents kind of look at you and they're not sure what to do with you. And I mean, it started easily enough. I did have
and you're
a paper
the older
route.
of the two, right? Your sister's younger, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
that's
so
right.
You had the double edge.
Yeah. And I did have a paper route. It was a little local paper called The Town and Country. And I vividly remember it because it would arrive at 3 or 4 in the morning.
Wow.
And I had to get those papers all folded up. And then I had this great big carrier that I would put over my shoulder, and I would just go from door to door all over the neighborhood. And at one point, I was not that big until I reached adolescence. That whole thing was almost as big as I was.
Probably so weighed about the same amount, right?
Well, it sure felt like it. I mean, it was the closest I've ever been to being pregnant, right? You have all that weight on the front and you feel like you're going to fall over. But I also just had a natural predisposition for living entrepreneurially. And so when I got to high school, I loved cars. They were, I guess you might almost call that a hobby of mine too. And English professors don't drive cool cars. We had a we had a 1976 Honda Accord, and we had a 1981 Subaru GL wagon. And both of those are great, reliable little cars, very practical. But I was admiring Porsches and Jaguars.
Oh, yeah.
So in high school, as soon as I got my driver's license, I set up a little company called Chuck's Custom Car Cleaning.
Oh,
in today's world, that would be auto detailing, but there wasn't so much of an industry for that back then. But I would be hired by people who knew I was meticulous. I would clean these cars inside out, top to bottom. I'd deoxidize the paint, shampoo the carpet. I'd even write down a list for them of all the things that I noticed that were wrong, dings in the fenders, lights that were burned out. But I took about 3 hours on average for each vehicle, and I charged $75 a car. So I was making on average about $25 an hour. And this is in the 1980s.
Yeah, not bad at all. I love it. I love it. That's so cool. And what did you spend all that extra money on? Did you actually buy that dream car at one point, or where did it all go?
Well, it took a while to get to that. The money that I raised or earned, I started putting into a fund for college, and that was pretty important because the place where I went to school ended up costing a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, got it. And you kind of had your eyes on Harvard for some time, did you? Or how did you end up choosing that? Or did they choose you? It's kind of a sorting hat thing, isn't it?
Well, it is a big sorting thing. And I'm sure it's very much that way today for any of the more noted schools where you have a lot of applicants, more applicants than you do people who can attend. And I remember that I applied to 8 different schools because I didn't know where I would get in and where I wouldn't. I mean, typically for a lot of them, they'd take one applicant out of every 15, something like that.
Sure.
And I was fortunate. I was accepted across the board at all 8 of those schools. And at the end of the day, I was debating between 3 schools. I loved the atmosphere at Stanford, which had this team-based structure for student learning, which I thought was really neat. Princeton, I loved because of the physical setting. It was the quintessential Ivy League campus, just gorgeous. Harvard, I loved because it was so cosmopolitan and there were so many things to do. And if there wasn't something you wanted to do, you were encouraged to go set it up for yourself.
There you go.
With the entrepreneurial predisposition that I had, I decided that I would go to Harvard, and that's where I ended up studying.
Yeah, awesome. Well, and Boston is just such a wonderful town. Went through the same thing with my daughter, who's graduated from Dartmouth actually next weekend.
Oh, congratulations!
We did the whole sorting thing, and fell in love with Princeton for the same areas. But you studied organizational development. Tell us a little bit about your choice of that field of study.
It's so fun to say I studied organizational development. What most people don't know is that at the time I was a student there was not a major in that field.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I wrestled with that because I knew that I wanted to go into business, but Harvard as an undergraduate is a liberal arts program.
Right.
So I decided to get entrepreneurial, and I petitioned the university to create my own major.
Oh, awesome.
Which allowed me over a period of about a year to petition and then successfully establish the organizational development curriculum at Harvard for undergraduates.
That's great.
Which today is their most popular undergraduate major, which is remarkable to me.
Yeah.
What was fun, it was housed in the psychology department, but it allowed me to take courses across the university, both at the undergraduate and the graduate level, including graduate schools like the Business School, the Divinity School, and so forth. And it enabled a lot of things that seemed disparate to be connected together.
Yeah. Interestingly, I did the same thing at University of Oregon. Not quite the same level tier of university, but I got an international business degree, which they did not have. And it was kind of a political science, economics, and business degree. And it's really fun kind of doing cross-disciplinary studies, isn't it? You must have enjoyed that a lot.
I loved it because I often live in the overlaps.
Right.
I see connections, and that's often been a good thing and a hard thing for me as a working professional, because our corporate world is typically set up and structured in compartments, and I tend to see across departments. Yeah.
Well, and you went to P&G, great company. We talked about that a little bit earlier. I know that they heavily recruited Harvard. Did you kind of get pulled in through that funnel, or was that a company that you had your sights set on wanting to get into brand management?
I knew nothing about Procter Gamble when I was in school, but while I was at Harvard, I started another company. It was a laser printing business based on what was then Apple Computer's brand new Macintosh computer and laser writer printer, which massively disrupted the whole typeset industry.
Right. That's right. All the fonts and everything else. Yeah.
Yes. And desktop publishing and all that kind of thing. the notoriety for that business, which had 12 employees from Harvard and Tufts, and I sold it to the university when I graduated. They still run it. And there were some articles published about it in the Boston Globe and some other newspapers. And so Procter & Gamble's recruiting department found out about me through that. So P&G had reached out to me when I became a senior. And if they hadn't, I never would have considered the company.
Yeah. And what attracted you to join them and move to Cincinnati?
What attracted me was a concept that was half true.
I laugh only because I'm a proctoid and I know what you mean. I know where you're going to go with this.
So the guy who recruited me, his name was Stan Howdy. I don't know if you ever bumped into him, but he was in their recruiting department. And he said, Chuck, if you work at Procter & Gamble, you're going to have the best of both worlds. You're going to be assigned to a brand group, which will be small and entrepreneurial. Yet at the same time, you'll have the vast resources of this large multinational company. So it can be intrapreneurial, which was true to a degree. So each brand group did have a close-knit feel, and you certainly had a strong focus on your particular category and brand product. On the other hand, P&G's operating style was not exactly what I would call entrepreneurial.
Bureaucratic is probably a lot more like it. And you were in the paper division, of course, which is one of the most successful and largest divisions in the company.
Right.
What brands did you work on when you were there?
Well, much to the horror of my parents, who had taken out a second mortgage on their house to send their son to Harvard with visions that I would also go into academia. And of course, I move into the parochial Midwest and I take this position at Procter & Gamble, and then the company assigns me to toilet paper.
Oh, goodness.
Or at Procter & Gamble, what we call bath tissue.
Of course.
The brand to which I was assigned at the time was called White Cloud, which was a super premium product, which, to be honest, was softer and thicker than anyone wanted to flush down the toilet. So it was a struggling brand, doing only $60 million a year in sales. And at the time that I was hired, my brand manager told me that he wanted me to bring an entrepreneurial spark to toilet paper. And I remember telling him at the time, I said, that could be combustible.
Not sure you want to have those two together.
Which it was.
I love it. And you spent about 3 years there. Now, did you get some leadership experience there? Did you have management responsibilities before you moved on to Gallo, California?
I did. I was promoted into Bounty paper towels. So I was moving on up, as George Jefferson used to say. And I ended up working both on Bounty Current and Bounty Future, meaning that a brand group on the one hand that focuses on the current product in the marketplace and another one focused on future products. That was a lot of fun for me. It was an opportunity with expanded responsibilities to identify new niches, work on substantially sized marketing campaigns, and have some tailored programs that dealt with problematic issues, areas of the country where the product wasn't selling well, and how to intervene and improve performance and things like that. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, awesome. And what led you to make that transition out to California?
I met my wife at P&G, and Gerald was in what was called product supply. She ended up deciding to go back to graduate school and was admitted to Stanford University, where she decided to attend and work towards a PhD. So we ended up moving out to the San Francisco Bay Area. And it was one of those early times in my adult life where I'm starting to learn that there are some decisions in your career that aren't a me decision, they're a we decision. And we were trying to figure out how to juggle both of our careers. It was a major change. And at the time that we moved, the U.S. was involved in the first Iraq War with Saddam Hussein.
Early
and
90s,
so there was President George H.W. Bush had kind of launched a military intervention there. The timing wasn't great for me in terms of finding a job. And so I remember just trying to figure out the landscape of the San Francisco Bay Area. There are some cool companies out there, Levi Strauss, Ghirardelli Chocolates.
Del Monte.
Del Monte. But the one that was hiring was Gallo.
Yeah,
So I ended up becoming somebody in management in varietal table wines at the Gallo Winery, and made a massive shift in doing so, not just the kind of product, but the type of company. Whereas P&G was publicly held, Gallo was privately held. It was truly a huge family business with radically different dynamics.
And did you move out to Modesto, or did you commute from Stanford?
We lived in the Livermore Pleasanton area, which is kind of midway. My wife commuted into Palo Alto for Stanford, and I would commute into Modesto.
Right. Cool. Great. And you spent a couple of years there and then ended back up in Cincinnati. So tell us about how that transition took place.
Well, that was an unexpected transition. And to be honest, I would have stayed at Gallo and I would have stayed in California. However, my wife really struggled with the lifestyle in California.
Was she a Midwesterner? Did she grew up in
Cincinnati? Yes. She grew up in this tiny little town in Ohio called Orrville, where Smucker's Jams and Jellies is headquartered.
Sure.
She was the first person in her family to go to college and came from just, very humble beginnings with a very close-knit family. We move out to the Bay Area with kind of a bedroom lifestyle, meaning that you would commute your way to wherever you were going, spend all day at work, get home with commuting about 8 at night, have dinner, and then it's time to go to bed and get up the next day and do the same thing again. And one day she headed back to see her parents for a vacation. I stayed behind, and I picked her up at the airport in San Francisco. And this is, of course, before 9/11 and all the security restrictions. So I'm right at the gate waiting for her to get off the plane. And she walks off and she's crying. And she looks at me and she said, "I hate California."
Oh, goodness, at the top of her lungs.
And that was the beginning of the end. So we ended up moving back to Ohio. She wanted to be closer to her family, and that brought us back to Cincinnati because Procter Gamble wanted to rehire my wife in engineering. She's very, very capable lady. And also as a female in engineering, which is unusual, the company was really trying to diversify its workforce. And in my case, I took a management position at LensCrafters, which was headquartered in Cincinnati.
Which actually happened to be founded by a bunch of ex-Procter guys.
Yes, that's right. And unlike P&G, had a more entrepreneurial vibe for sure.
Yeah, many of those guys came from the food and beverage division, for which I'd worked in. That's kind of a little piece of trivia. So, your wife's name is Jero, you'd mentioned?
Gerald.
And she's still with P&G?
She just retired.
Oh, great for her. Cool. So a long-standing career. Well, wonderful. So back to LensCrafters, and then did that for about a year and a half or so. And that brings us to SKILLSOURCE. Let's just take a step back, though, a little bit. And I'd love to just ask you some of those things that I always like to kind of get into is, before you kind of went entrepreneurial and started SKILLSOURCE, and I want to hear a lot more about that. What were some of the leadership lessons that you kind of took along the way? If you reflect back on those years, 3 great companies, obviously Procter, Gallo, and LensCrafters. And if you had to kind of distill, some of the things that you learned most or best about, working with people and leading them, what would have those been, Chuck?
What a great question. I think looking back on it, each company taught me something different that was pretty significant and substantially different because each company was so different. They were all industry-leading firms.
That's right.
But culturally and operationally, they were substantially distinctive. Looking back at my days at Procter & Gamble, one of the key leadership things I took away from there was their concept of promote from within and developing talent, which is a very significant aspect of P&G's culture. But more generally, I think in my experience, it's a very valuable way to understand that if you get the right people into an organization and invest in their development over time, they become very significant long-term contributors. They carry an institutional knowledge of the business that enables you as a leader not just to optimize productivity, but to fortify your culture because they become culture carriers.
So true.
For Gallo, the key thing that I took away from that was the critical nature of grit. Let me explain. The backstory with the Gallo Winery, which is actually a tragedy, is that coming out of the Great Depression, because of just economic conditions, Ernest Gallo's father, in desperation, came home one day, shot his wife to death, and then shot himself. It was a double suicide.
Wow.
And Ernest Gallo, who became my boss, as a very young teenager, walks in on his dead parents and suddenly becomes head of household for his siblings with no means of support. He walks into a public library and discovers a book on growing grapes and decides that the way he's going to support his family is to start a wine business that could make enough money that they could keep a roof over their heads.
And how old was he at the time?
I believe he was 14.
Oh, my goodness.
If you can just imagine that. So Ernest was driven. And although he was a man of immense wealth, he lived very frugally. I think in part because those early traumatic days had pressed him so much. I remember he drove a late model Cadillac when I took a job there. It was probably almost 20 years old, and it was repaired by some of the maintenance men that were on the facility at Gallo, and they used duct tape to hold the thing together. But Ernest refused to get a new car. And he was absolutely relentless.
Julio was his brother, I believe, right?
Julio was his brother.
His younger
yes,
brother.
I got to know Julio. Their personalities were radically different. Julio was much more mellow. Ernest was very intense. But this drive to perform, which, to be honest, had this tragic root and had some fear at the center of it. It nonetheless is, in my experience, a critical quality for a leader to have the grit to persevere in trying circumstances. And Ernest absolutely did that.
Great overview. And then LensCrafters.
Well, the biggest lesson I took away from LensCrafters was the critical nature of staying true to your vision. At the time I was hired there, the company had just established a second decade vision for the business to be the best at helping the world to see. Very aspirational. Unfortunately, the company at the time was owned by U.S. Shoe Corporation.
That's right.
And U.S. Shoe was on its deathbed. I didn't know that at the time I took the job. But within months of being hired, LensCrafters sold out its international division. Think about this. The vision is to be the best at helping the world to see, but you're selling your global operations. And we began to compromise all kinds of long-term investments for LensCrafters in order to funnel cash to U.S. Shoe, which was hemorrhaging cash at the time.
I think LensCrafters was one of the only, if not the only, profitable subsidiary, if I recall that.
It was the only profitable subsidiary. So the company that I thought I was being hired into and the company I actually worked in were two very different firms. LensCrafters wasn't in a position to be its best version of itself, not even close. What I took away from that from a leadership point of view is staying true to your vision. Because the minute you walk away from the purpose that grounds you, you start to lose ground.
Right. So true. So from those foundations, SKILLSOURCE was founded, and I think you left about a year and a half or so after joining LensCrafters. What was the need that you saw in the marketplace that motivated you to set up SKILLSOURCE? So maybe before you answer that question, tell us a little bit about what SKILLSOURCE is. Many of our audience may not know, exactly what you do with SKILLSOURCE.
Sure. SKILLSOURCE today is a consultancy that focuses on three things: developing winning strategies, strong leaders, and healthy cultures.
Beautiful.
That is an evolution of the business model when we first launched back in 1995. Where I found myself was in a place of real frustration at LensCrafters because I had wanted to work in an aspirational company, but it was much more of a perspirational season in that business's existence. And I was just chafing in that environment. What ended up happening was my decision to go out on my own. And again, I had entrepreneurial bones to begin with. What I thought I could do would be to take some of the disciplines that I had learned from these big companies and bring them to smaller businesses at an affordable price.
Yeah.
The idea was to create a virtual corporation where I'd be the only employee and I would hire contractors, assemble them in teams to go serve in clients so that we could help them with their problems. And in those early days, that was while not radical, that was a very unusual model for business because the idea was that you would start out as a single shingle, and then as soon as you could, you'd start hiring employees and you'd build a bench and all of that. And I was doing exactly the opposite. My thinking was if I could keep the contractor model, then I could bring in the best people for a given job and not sort of have to use the people who were my employees. I could keep the overhead lower, and then I could charge less on an hourly or a project basis to the client, which would enable me to work with them for a more extended period of time and ensure that we delivered results. That was the mindset.
In that model.
Yes,
well, I mean, your time.
Today it's commonplace, but back then it was really an aberration.
And who were you serving? Was it middle market companies, other consumer brand companies? Did you kind of stick to what you knew in those early days?
These were typically what I'll loosely call emerging small businesses. They had gone through startup. They had gone through the early challenges of viability, and they were now struggling with what I'd call capability, how you hit on all cylinders. There were typically certain areas of the business that worked great and others that didn't. Classic example would be a firm with a hard-charging visionary CEO who's very charismatic and sells a whole bunch of business that he doesn't have the operational infrastructure to support.
Right.
And then his staff, is dying on the vine trying to keep up with the founder, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that.
Yeah. And would you kind of move into, or you and your people move into kind of interim C-suite positions? I mean, that's what we'd call them today. I'm sure you didn't call them back then, though. But, in other words, a person would come in and kind of be that full-time marketing person for a while and then move out, or was it really much more of a consultancy type of approach?
Great question. The way that I positioned myself at the time was think of me and think of SKILLSOURCE as we're on your team, but we're not on your payroll.
Yeah, right.
We earn our keep every month as we're working on projects of different kinds. And the neat thing about it was that because our price point was affordable, I would typically, and our team would typically stay with the clients for months and sometimes years. So we became what today would be called outsourced or fractional leadership.
Right.
But back then we didn't have those terms. It was more just, we are an affordable way to be part of your company, even though we're not officially employees. And we built the kind of relationships that enabled us to be full-fledged members. I mean, they really thought of us as part of their team. We were invited to their annual gatherings and key meetings and stuff like that. The key thing that I learned, though, in those early years was that there was this gap between the original business model and the needs that the clients really had. Because in the early days, my thinking was help them develop a strong strategic direction and then help them implement it. And if I just do that, plan the work and work the plan, then we would have delivered what they needed. What I didn't realize going into it was the extent to which having a great strategy was not enough. Because we would put these plans together that had tremendous promise, but then I would come back as that outsourced person every month or every quarter or whatever the rhythm was, and I would discover that either things hadn't been implemented or they'd been implemented very poorly. Many times the failures were, to me, just remarkable in that they were so avoidable. And I started digging. It's like, what's going wrong? What I discovered was two root causes. One was poor leadership, people that just didn't know how to take a project and lead it through an organization. The other root cause problem was toxic culture, where people were so demotivated that even if there was a plan to make things better, they didn't start working on that plan, even though it would have been to their benefit.
Right. So did that lead to some evolution in terms of how you approach SKILLSOURCE over the years?
Yes, that's why our model today is focused on winning strategies, strong leaders, and healthy cultures, because it's become our experience that, like a stool with three legs, if any one of those is missing, the stool falls over.
So true. Yeah, so true. And are your consultants still the same model, contractors now that will go out and work with the companies in that regard? You still follow that same
Yes.
model? Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And are they dedicated to those companies? In other words, do they have multiple assignments, or do they pretty much put their full time into that company, days, weeks, months, years on end?
They're fractional. So they
Right.
are assigned to that company and typically will stay with them for an extended period of time, but they also serve many other companies.
They may have other companies working.
Yeah.
Yeah. Terrific. Wonderful. And then most recently, well, still about 18 years ago, you've been doing this 25, 26 years, but At Work on Purpose, which is kind of how our paths cross. Tell us a little bit about that, what that is, and kind of bring it back to your ministry.
I went through a really interesting journey that brought me to this place of pondering faith life brought into work life. Well,
let's rewind a little bit. So you mentioned earlier on that you didn't necessarily grow up in a particularly Christian or religious household. Did you come to Christ later in life, or tell us a little bit about that journey, or was it about that same time?
Actually, it was an extended period of time, and it started on the toilet paper business at Procter Gamble.
Right. Cool.
The brand group to which I was assigned really was struggling so badly that within about 6 to 9 months after I'd been hired, all of my brand group had left.
Wow.
And I was left as the senior person still on that product, and ended up creating a strategy for it to succeed by taking 30 sheets off of the roll. And we wound the roll more loosely, so the diameter was the same, as before the sheet count reduction. But I looked at the project and I was out there marketing it as new and improved. New because it had 30 fewer sheets, and improved because we took a tiny increase in the thickness of the paper. And there's nothing illegal about doing that. Companies do stuff like that all the time. It's an indirect price increase. However, I felt so empty doing that kind of project work. And I remember one day walking home from work and thinking to myself, I'm going to get promoted for short sheeting the consumer.
Not a particularly motivating thought.
No, I essentially went through a midlife crisis in my early 20s.
Yeah. Wow.
And when I got back to my apartment, I started pondering some memories back when I had been at Harvard University and had made friends with people from all over the world representing all the faith traditions of the world. And they shared their faith testimonies, as I would now describe it. At the time, they were just conversations.
Right.
But my point is that I thought that night, after this awakening of sorts at Procter & Gamble, that I needed to figure out if there was some sort of a spiritual core or center to my life, some kind of foundation that could help me feel complete or whole, even in seasons where work wasn't all it was cut out to be, and so forth. And it launched for me a 10-year project where I was studying comparative world religion and philosophy.
Wow.
And that process continued all through my time at Procter & Gamble, at the Gallo Winery, at LensCrafters, and then starting this little consultancy called SKILLSOURCE. So my point, in short, is that my struggles with work life and what a career should be that feels like it was what you were created for or born for, led me into a spiritual search that then led me as a Christian. So I commit my life to Christ in my early 30s, leads me as a Christian to figure out how to help myself and other people integrate faith and work.
Wow, that's fabulous. And so again, At Work on Purpose came out of that journey, and your work also at SKILLSOURCE, I assume, right? I mean,
yes.
Tell us a little bit about At Work, perhaps, and give us what that looks like and what do you do with that?
The basic premise behind At Work on Purpose is that if you believe in a God and you believe in the God that Christianity brings forward, then you would believe that God creates us for a purpose in our lives, that we aren't created aimlessly, we're created directionally, that there's a direction, a path, and a contribution for us to make in the world. With the implication of that is that we shouldn't just go get a job and succeed in a career. We should look for the work that could enable us to best serve the world in the way that God created us. That's a completely different way of thinking about work life. So At Work on Purpose is a ministry guiding working Christians to find and fulfill God's call on their lives at work.
And how do you execute that? Is that organized as a nonprofit? Do you kind of mentor and disciple others that are in the workplace? Do they approach you? Tell us a little bit about that.
It's in many ways across the city of Cincinnati, it's akin to a network of working Christians who know each other through relationship, and they connect together, not just in their places of work, but across the city, just as Christians who are working in the private, public, social sectors. In terms of programmatic emphasis, what we do is first to come alongside working Christians in what we describe as purposeful employment. Sometimes people reach out to us when they've lost a job, and they don't just want to get another job. They're trying to find the right job, the job that God would have for them. Other times they're in a job, but they feel like it's empty. They don't like it, and they don't know what to do about that. But regardless, we come alongside those people in a moment of frustration and dissatisfaction and help them reroute into what we call purposeful employment. Then from there, we can walk with them into building out what that looks like.
And is that structured as a nonprofit or a for-profit consultancy?
It's a not-for-profit organization, which essentially then means that I lead two very separate kinds of organizations. SKILLSOURCE is a for-profit company, and it serves clients who are all over the map spiritually. And At Work on Purpose is a nonprofit organization that serves working Christians.
Yeah, fantastic. And those Christians that would come to you with those types of issues, do they pay a fee? How do they kind of engage with you on that? Or is it all volunteer that you have mentors and disciples that help others? Or is it something you do exclusively with others?
It's both and. When they first reach out to us, it's in the beginning the opportunity to connect them into a community of working Christians. And there isn't a charge for that. That's free.
Sure.
And sometimes they want more support. They want a coach that can help them think through what work God might have for them or how they can resolve issues they have at work. And so in a sense, there's an a la carte system where there are certain services that they can sign up for where there is a tuition or a fee, but then a lot of other stuff that is done by volunteers and free of charge.
Yeah, so you've got some other volunteers that are involved with that that help that along. Fantastic. Great. Wonderful work. Well, listen, Chuck, this has been a tremendous conversation, and I can't believe we're almost out of time here, but we always ask our guests one last question, and that's, what kind of career and life advice would you give to someone that, maybe has their eyes on the corner office or maybe wants to become an entrepreneur like yourself? And, you've got such an interesting background in that you worked for, 3 wonderful companies of which laid these great foundations that you've explained for us, and then decided to go out on your own. And you've obviously done that successfully for years and years now. What would you say to someone who's maybe, in those early 30s as we've gone through and, kind of finding our own path and maybe thinking about some of those things themselves? What would you tell them? What would you advise them to do to, help them sort out whether, going to a startup and doing something on their own, or perhaps following their dream, or maybe sticking with it in the corporate environment? What were some of the questions that you had asked yourself, I guess is what I'm getting at, that would help them guide their journey?
I remember years ago with Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People that he talked about the concept of beginning with the end in mind.
Yeah.
I believe that it's really important to ask ourselves the question, where do I want to end up at the end of my working days?
Yeah.
And that is a question of legacy.
That's right.
If I'm looking back on decades of work life, what legacy do I want to leave behind? What would I like people to say about the work that I did, the projects that I led, the contributions that I made? I have found for me,
it's the dash, right? We talk about the dash on the.
It's the dash. It's the dash between this is the year I entered the workforce and this is when I ended my working career. And the dash is all that stuff in the middle. And to me, it's very much about legacy. And I believe that our most important legacy is service. How are we taking ourselves to serve others, to leave the world better than we found it?
And each of us have to ask that own question because there are different paths to serve, right? Always different paths to serve.
Yes.
Chuck Proudfit, president at SKILLSOURCE and founder of At Work on Purpose. Thank you so much for sharing your journey into the corner office.
Thank you for having me. It's been an honor to be part of this today.
Thank you for listening to Into the Corner Office with Brant Handley. We hope you enjoyed hearing our guest CEO story as much as we did. If you want to hear more CEOs reveal their journey into the corner office, please subscribe via iTunes and tell your friends and colleagues. For more information about Brant, Resource Options International, and the mighty middle market, visit www.goforroi.com. We look forward to having you join us for our next episode.